The prestigious Westwood Heights neighborhood was known for its manicured lawns, luxury vehicles, and residents who considered themselves the elite of Sierra City. On this particular summer afternoon, the gathering at the Palmer estate was the social event of the season. Champagne flowed freely among the guests dressed in designer clothes, their laughter echoing across the expansive backyard. Marcus Johnson wiped the sweat from his brow as he carefully navigated the winding driveway of the Palmer estate. His delivery van, bearing the logo of Swift Courier Services, was packed with carefully wrapped packages for the charity gala. The sun beat down mercilessly on his dark skin as he adjusted his simple uniform, a polo shirt and khaki pants that had seen better days. At 45, Marcus's face carried the gentle lines of a man who had weathered life's storms but still found reasons to smile. His hands, strong and calloused from years of hard work, gripped the steering wheel with purpose. Today's delivery was particularly important special items for the charity auction that would benefit Sierra City Children's Hospital. As he parked and began unloading the packages, he couldn't help but notice the curious glances from the guests gathered on the lawn. A woman in a flowing designer dress whispered something to her companion, and they both laughed, eyes fixed on Marcus as he struggled with a particularly large box. "Careful with that. It probably costs more than you make in a year," called out Richard Palmer, the host, loud enough for his friends to hear. More laughter followed, cutting through the air like glass. Marcus kept his eyes down, focusing on his task. He'd learned long ago that dignity sometimes meant silence in the face of disrespect. As he approached the entrance with his dolly stacked with boxes, a group of guests blocked his path, seemingly unaware of his presence or perhaps deliberately ignoring it. "Excuse me," Marcus said politely. "I need to deliver these items for the auction." A tall man with silver hair looked him up and down. "Service entrance is around back," he said dismissively, not bothering to move. But before Marcus could respond, a sharp voice cut through the uncomfortable moment. "That's not how we treat people in my house, Gerald." The crowd parted to reveal Eleanor Palmer, Richard's wife, her eyes flashing with disapproval. Unlike her husband, Eleanor's warm smile and genuine respect for everyone, regardless of their station in life, had earned her admiration throughout Sierra City. "Please come right this way," she said to Marcus, gesturing him through. As he passed, she added quietly, "I apologize for my guest's behavior." Little did the laughing crowd know that the man they were dismissing would soon change their perspective in ways none of them could imagine. Marcus carefully arranged the auction items in the designated area, his movements precise and methodical. Each piece was positioned with care: rare art pieces, luxury experiences, and specialized items that would help raise funds for the Children's Hospital's new cancer wing. As he worked, Eleanor Palmer observed him from across the room. Unlike the others, she noticed the way he handled each item with knowledge and respect. The way his eyes lingered appreciatively on a particular painting suggested he knew exactly what he was looking at. "You have a good eye," she commented, approaching him as he adjusted a small bronze sculpture. Marcus smiled politely. Giacometti's style is unmistakable, even in his lesser-known works. "This is a beautiful piece." Eleanor's eyebrows raised slightly. "Most people wouldn't recognize it." "I've been fortunate enough to see his work in various galleries," Marcus replied simply, continuing with his task. Before Eleanor could inquire further, her husband Richard appeared with several of his friends, champagne glasses in hand. "Everything in order with the deliveries?" Richard asked, his tone making it clear he was speaking to his wife rather than to Marcus. "Yes," Eleanor replied. "Mr. I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name." "Johnson." "Marcus Johnson," he supplied with a nod. "Mr. Johnson has been extremely helpful. In fact, he was just sharing his knowledge about the Giacometti piece." One of Richard's friends, a gallery owner named Philip, laughed. "Well, I'm sure he's picked up a thing or two driving around other people's treasures." Marcus said nothing, but continued arranging the display with dignity. His silence only seemed to encourage them. "Say," delivery man called another guest, a woman dripping in jewelry. "While you're here, could you help set up some of the tables? The caterers seem to be running behind." Marcus looked up, meeting her gaze steadily. "I'd be happy to help however I can, ma'am. That's why I'm here, after all." His gracious response in the face of their condescension only seemed to amuse them more, As Marcus finished his work and prepared to leave, Eleanor approached him again. "Thank you for your patience today," she said quietly. "Not everyone here represents the spirit of what we're trying to accomplish with this charity event." Marcus nodded. "I understand, Mrs. Palmer. People can only see what they're prepared to see." His words carried no bitterness, only a simple truth. "Will you be attending the gala tonight?" she asked suddenly. A small smile played at the corners of Marcus's mouth. "Yes, I believe I will." "Wonderful," Eleanor replied, slightly surprised. "I look forward to seeing you there." As Marcus drove away from the Palmer estate, his mind wasn't on the rude guests or their laughter. Instead, he thought about the children at Sierra City Children's Hospital. His daughter, Amara, had been treated there 3 years ago for leukemia. The doctors and nurses had saved her life, and now, at 16, she was thriving. His gratitude could never be fully expressed, but he'd found ways to give back. At home, a modest but comfortable house on the other side of town, Amara greeted him with a hug. "How was the delivery, Dad?" she asked, her bright eyes and healthy glow a daily reminder of what truly mattered in life. "Educational," Marcus replied with a chuckle. "People will always surprise you, sometimes with their unkindness, sometimes with their goodness. Like Dr. Reynolds always says, prejudice is just a failure of imagination," Amara quoted. "Speaking of Dr. Reynolds, we'll be seeing her tonight at the gala." Amara nodded excitedly. "I've got my speech all prepared. I'm nervous but ready." "You'll be amazing," Marcus assured her, kissing the top of her head. "Now, let's get ready. I have a feeling tonight is going to be quite memorable." In his bedroom, Marcus opened his closet and pushed aside his work uniforms. From the back, he pulled out a garment bag containing an impeccably tailored tuxedo. Next to it hung various framed degrees and awards, normally stored away from visitors' eyes: his MBA from Harvard Business School, his commendations from previous executive positions, and photographs with well-known figures in the business and philanthropy worlds. Marcus Johnson, the man they had laughed at and dismissed, was in fact Dr. Marcus Johnson, formerly the chief operations officer of one of the largest healthcare companies in the country. After his daughter's illness, he had walked away from his high-powered career to establish the Johnson Foundation, which worked specifically to address healthcare inequities in underserved communities. His job as a delivery driver was actually volunteer work, part of his personal commitment to understand the experiences of working-class individuals in Sierra City. 3 days a week, he drove for Swift Courier Services, donating his modest paycheck back to the company's Employee Assistance Fund. The other 4 days, he ran his foundation and sat on the boards of multiple hospitals and non-profits, including Sierra City Children's Hospital. As he slipped into his tuxedo, Marcus reflected on the day's events without anger. Tonight wasn't about proving anyone wrong or seeking vindication. It was about the children who needed help, like his Amara once did. Everything else was secondary. The ballroom of the Grand Sierra Hotel sparkled with crystal chandeliers and elegantly dressed guests. At $1,000 per plate, the charity gala for the Children's Hospital had drawn the city's wealthiest and most influential citizens, doctors, business leaders, politicians, and philanthropists united for one evening under the banner of compassion. Richard Palmer stood at the entrance with Eleanor, greeting guests with practiced charm. His smile faltered slightly when he spotted Marcus and Amara Johnson arriving. Marcus was transformed in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, and Amara looked lovely in a simple blue gown that complemented her dark skin. "Isn't that the delivery man?" Richard whispered to Eleanor, confusion evident in his voice. Eleanor simply smiled. "Yes, and I believe he mentioned he'd be here. Let's greet them properly." Before Richard could respond, Dr. Helen Reynolds, the chief of pediatric oncology, rushed forward to embrace Marcus warmly. "Marcus, perfect timing. The board members are all here, and we were just discussing the matching grant proposal," Dr. Reynolds said, before turning to Amara with equal affection. "And here's our star speaker. Are you ready for tonight, young lady?" Amara nodded confidently. "All prepared, Dr. Reynolds." Richard watched this exchange with growing confusion, which only increased when the hospital's chief administrator approached to shake Marcus's hand with obvious respect. "Mr. Palmer," the administrator said, turning to Richard, "I see you've already met Dr. Johnson, our board vice chair and head of the expansion funding committee." Richard's face paled. "Dr. Johnson." "Yes," Marcus said, extending his hand with a genuine smile. "We met earlier today, though we weren't formally introduced. I was delivering the auction items." Eleanor watched her husband struggle to compose himself. Nearby, she noticed several of the guests from the afternoon, including Philip the gallery owner and the bejeweled woman who had asked Marcus to set up tables, all watching with dawning recognition and embarrassment. "But you're a delivery driver," Richard stammered. Marcus nodded. 3 days a week, yes. It's volunteer work that keeps me connected to the community we serve. The rest of the time I run the Johnson Foundation." Before Richard could further embarrass himself, the event coordinator announced that dinner would be served. As they moved toward their tables, Eleanor noticed that Marcus and Amara were seated at the head table with the hospital administrators and major donors, a place of honor that spoke volumes about his true position. Throughout dinner, Richard and his friends watched as various distinguished guests stopped by Marcus's table to speak with him. It became increasingly clear that the man they had dismissed and laughed at just hours earlier was not only respected but influential in circles they aspired to join. "Did you know?" Richard whispered accusingly to Eleanor. "But not exactly," she admitted. "But I suspected he was more than he appeared." He recognized the Giacometti immediately, and there was something in his manner, a confidence that comes from knowing your worth isn't determined by others' perceptions. After dinner, Dr. Reynolds approached the podium for the evening's program. "Thank you all for your generosity tonight. Before we begin the auction, I want to share a story that embodies why we're here." She gestured toward Amara. 3 years ago, a brilliant young girl came to our hospital with an aggressive form of leukemia. Tonight, she's here to tell you her story in her own words. Please welcome Amara Johnson." Amara stood confidently at the microphone, her poise remarkable for a 16-year-old. "When I was 13, I was given a 30% chance of survival," she began, her clear voice capturing the audience's attention. "Thanks to the incredible team at Sierra City Children's Hospital, I'm standing here today, cancer-free for 2 years." She spoke eloquently about her battle, the treatments, the fear, and finally, the hope. "But I was one of the lucky ones," she continued. "My father had the resources to take time off work to be with me every day of my treatment. He could afford the medications not covered by insurance. Too many families don't have these privileges." As she spoke, many in the audience were moved to tears. Richard Palmer and his friends, however, were experiencing a different kind of emotion as the pieces fell into place. "After my recovery," Amara continued, "my father made a decision. He left his position as CEO of Health First National to establish the Johnson Foundation, dedicated to ensuring that every child, regardless of their family's financial situation, receives the same level of care I did." The room erupted in applause. Marcus watched his daughter with undisguised pride, while across the room, the group who had laughed at him earlier sat in stunned silence. After Amara's speech, Dr. Reynolds returned to the podium. "And now, I'm honored to introduce the chair of our Expansion Fundraising Committee, whose foundation has already pledged a $10 million matching grant for our new cancer wing. Please welcome Dr. Marcus Johnson." The applause was thunderous as Marcus took the stage. His presence was commanding, his voice resonant with passion and purpose as he spoke about the hospital's mission. There was no trace of the quiet, deferential delivery man from earlier, not because that persona had been false, but because both were equally authentic parts of who he was. "Dignity isn't something granted by wealth or position," Marcus said toward the end of his speech. "It's inherent in every human being, whether they're delivering packages or performing surgery. At this hospital, every child is treated with the same respect, the same dedication, the same love, regardless of who their parents are or what they can afford." His eyes swept the room, briefly meeting Richard's gaze without a hint of reproach. "Tonight, I'm challenging everyone in this room to not only open your wallets but to open your hearts and minds. See the humanity in every person you encounter and recognize that true worth isn't measured by titles or possessions." By the time the auction began, the atmosphere in the ballroom had shifted. Those who had witnessed the afternoon's events at the Palmer estate now sat uncomfortably, confronted by their own behavior in a new light. The auction was a tremendous success, raising over $2 million for the Children's Hospital. As the evening wound down, Marcus found himself approached by a contrite Richard Palmer. "Dr. Johnson," Richard began awkwardly, "I owe you an apology for this afternoon. My behavior was inexcusable." Marcus studied him for a moment. "Mr. Palmer, I don't need an apology for myself, but I hope tonight has been enlightening." "It has," Richard admitted. "More than you know." He hesitated, then continued. "I've been successful in business for so long that I started believing my own myths that wealth and status were accurate measures of a person's value. Today was humbling." "Humility is a good place to start," Marcus replied, "but it's what you do next that matters." Nearby, Eleanor watched this exchange with a mixture of embarrassment for her husband and admiration for Marcus's grace. She approached with Amara, who had been receiving congratulations from guests, impressed by her speech. "Your daughter is remarkable," Eleanor said to Marcus, "and so is her father." Amara smiled. "My dad always says actions reveal character. That's why he still drives the delivery van, even though he doesn't need to. He says it keeps him honest." The conversation was interrupted by Philip, the gallery owner, and several others from the afternoon gathering. Their apologies were profuse and uncomfortable. "Dr. Johnson," Philip said, "I've never felt more ashamed of myself. The way we treated you." Marcus raised a hand to stop him. "We all make judgments based on incomplete information. The question is whether we're willing to revise those judgments when we learn more." "I'd like to learn more," Richard said suddenly. "About your foundation's work, about what you're trying to accomplish." Marcus looked genuinely surprised, then pleased. "I'd be happy to have that conversation." As the gala came to a close, Dr. Reynolds announced the final fundraising total over $3 million, with Marcus's matching grant included. The new cancer wing would become a reality, bringing hope to countless children like Amara. In the weeks that followed, something unexpected happened. Richard Palmer, moved by his encounter with Marcus and Amara, began to change. He started by making a substantial donation to the Johnson Foundation, but more significantly, he began volunteering at the Children's Hospital himself, reading to patients, organizing activities, and using his business connections to secure additional support. The experience transformed him. For the first time, he was seeing people really seeing them beyond the narrow confines of wealth and status. The children in the cancer ward didn't care about his bank account or his social standing. They just appreciated his time, his kindness, his willingness to be present with them in their struggles. One afternoon, as Richard was leaving the hospital after his volunteer shift, he spotted a familiar figure in the parking lot. Marcus, in his delivery uniform, unloading packages from his van. "Back on delivery duty?" Richard asked, approaching him. Marcus nodded with a smile. "Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. Some of my most important work happens in this uniform." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "I think I'm beginning to understand why. There's a delivery service that brings toys and books to the kids here," Marcus explained. "They're always looking for volunteer drivers." Richard considered this for a moment. Would they take on someone like me, with no experience? "I think that could be arranged," Marcus replied with a warm smile. "Everyone has to start somewhere." 6 months later, a very different scene unfolded at the Palmer estate. The backyard was filled with children and families from the hospital, patients past and present, doctors, nurses, and volunteers. Among them, Richard Palmer, not in designer clothes, but in the simple uniform of a volunteer delivery driver, was helping to serve food alongside Marcus Johnson. The two men had developed an unlikely friendship, united by their commitment to the hospital and the children it served. Richard had discovered something Marcus had known all along, that true fulfillment comes not from status or recognition, but from service and connection. As the sun began to set, Richard called for everyone's attention. "I want to thank you all for coming today. A year ago, I wouldn't have opened my home like this. I was too concerned with appearances, with impressing the right people." He looked at Marcus with genuine respect. "It took a delivery man to teach me what really matters." Amara, now serving as a peer mentor for newly diagnosed patients, stood nearby with Eleanor Palmer, who had become one of the hospital's most dedicated volunteers. "My dad always says that every person you meet is carrying a story you can't see," Amara commented quietly. Eleanor nodded. "Your father is a wise man. He changed Richard's story, and in doing so, he changed mine too." As the gathering continued into the evening, the Palmer estate, once a symbol of exclusivity and separation, had been transformed into a place of community and belonging. The laughter that filled the air now was different, not the mocking kind that diminishes others, but the joyful kind that celebrates our shared humanity. And in that transformation lay the greatest revelation of all. That seeing beyond appearances to recognize the inherent dignity in every person isn't just a moral imperative, it's the doorway to our own liberation from the prejudices that impoverish our lives. As the community gathering at the Palmer estate came to a close, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across faces that now shared more than just physical space. They shared purpose, understanding, and genuine connection. Marcus stood a bit apart, watching as Richard said goodbye to the last of the children and their families. The change in the man was remarkable, not just in his behavior, but in his entire demeanor. The arrogance had given way to humility, the dismissiveness to attentiveness. Richard had discovered what Marcus had known all along, that true wealth is measured in relationships, in positive impact, in the lives you touch. "Penny for your thoughts," said Eleanor, joining Marcus on the patio. "I was just reflecting on the journey," Marcus replied. "Not just Richard's, but all of ours." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "You know, when I first saw how they treated you that day, my husband, our friends, I was ashamed. But I wasn't much better. I was polite. Yes, but I still saw you through the lens of your uniform, your job. I still thought I was being gracious by treating the help with respect." "We all start somewhere," Marcus said gently. "The important thing is that we don't end there." Across the lawn, Amara was deep in conversation with a young boy, a new patient at the hospital, recently diagnosed. Her experience, her survival, offered something no doctor could provide: the living proof that there was life beyond cancer, that the darkness of diagnosis wasn't the end of the story. "Your daughter is extraordinary," Eleanor observed. "She's the reason for everything," Marcus replied simply. "When she was sick, I realized that all my success, all my status, meant nothing if I couldn't help her and all the children like her who don't have the advantages she had. Sometimes it takes nearly losing what's precious to see what truly matters." Richard joined them, his face tired but peaceful. The last family just left. That young boy, Tyler. Amara really connected with him. Marcus nodded. She sees herself in him. The fear, the uncertainty. "She's giving him something invaluable," Hope Richard said. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he added, "That's what you gave me, Marcus. Not just a lesson in humility, but hope that I could be better than I was." The three stood in comfortable silence as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. In the distance, the lights of Sierra City Children's Hospital were visible, a beacon of healing and hope on the hillside. "We all wear uniforms of one kind or another," Marcus reflected. "The mistake is in believing that the uniform defines the person wearing it." Eleanor smiled. "I'll never look at a delivery person the same way again." "That's a start," Marcus replied with a warm laugh. "But the real goal is to never look at anyone the same way again, to always remember that behind every face is a story as complex and worthy of respect as your own." As Marcus and Amara drove home that evening, the lights of the city glimmering around them, Amara turned to her father. "You changed them, Dad. All of them." Marcus shook his head gently. "No, sweetheart. They changed themselves. I just gave them a reason to look in the mirror." The delivery man they had laughed at had indeed revealed himself to be someone unexpected. Not because of his hidden credentials or his foundation or his wealth, but because of his capacity to respond to disrespect with dignity, to judgment with compassion, and to offer others the chance to see beyond the surface to the humanity we all share. And in that revelation lay a truth more powerful than any status or title could confer: that the measure of a person lies not in how they're seen by others, but in how they see others, and in having the courage to see themselves clearly too.